My dear students, we have come to the end of Unit 1, and this lecture is a recapitulation of all the topics that we have taken in the first unit. We have come to the end of our first unit, or it was a very rather long unit, and in this unit we have discussed the Victorian age, the Victorian era. We have taken almost 21 short lectures to cover this unit because it was a very long unit. Now, most of the important historical situation of the Victorian age we have discussed in this lecture, and all those who are interested in literature, please go through the lectures again and try to study them in detail. Almost all the important topics of the Victorian era we have covered. In our first lecture, we introduced the paper, and we introduced the first unit of our paper, and we said who is Queen Victoria and how she ascended the throne of Britain, and some other socio-political changes that were taking place in the Victorian era we mentioned in our first lecture. That was our first lecture of the first unit. In the second lecture, and we talked about the three Reform Acts. The Reform Act, the first Reform Act of 1832, the subsequent second and third Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884. Now, in that lecture we also discussed some of the different beneficial acts which were introduced by the British Parliament, the House of Commons. Now, we also talked about the rotten boroughs, the reorganization of the boroughs, etc. We also talked about Chartism and the People's Charter and the demand for, or the universal call for, enfranchisement, the right for every male to vote. So these were the topics that we covered in our second lecture. When we came to the third lecture, we discussed about the industrialization and the impact of industrialization in the Victorian era. We know the people were moving from the agrarian, the farm side or the villages to the industrialized cities, and the problems caused by that. So industrialization of the Victorian period. The factors that boosted industrialization were discussed. What were some of the factors that boosted the industrialization? We also discussed about the different impacts that industrialization made in the Victorian period. There was, on one side, there was a lot of progress. People were becoming richer. On the other side, there were the poor working class. The tension between the rich and the poor aggravated because of industrialization. Now, next lecture, the fourth lecture, we discussed about the rise of Oxford and Cambridge universities. This is an important topic which should be studied for the examination. The Oxford University, we said, which is the oldest university in the English-speaking world, and the Cambridge University, which grew out of the Oxford University, is the second oldest university, we said. Together they are known as Oxbridge. So we talked about the rejuvenation that is taking place, the revival that is taking place too in these two important universities during the Victorian era. So that was the lecture on the rise of Oxford and Cambridge universities. Then in our fifth lecture we discussed about the spread of science and technology, the growth of science and technology. There were many inventions and discoveries that were taking place in the Victorian time. Now, these factors caused the spread of science and technology. So, the growth of science and technology we have discussed. We discussed about Florence Nightingale and how the nursing profession, modern nursing profession came about, etc. So, that was our discussion about science and technology. So, in the succeeding lectures, we talked about Karl Marx and his theory of Marxism, how the revolutionary mind of Karl Marx will affect the people. The Communist Manifesto and the class struggle were explained. Marxism and the Marxist literary criticism is quite important for any student of literature. So the reformations that is coming about because of the Marxist ideals we discussed. It was an important topic that we discussed, Marx and Karl Marx and Marxism. Then we talked about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. This particular theory of evolution, the origin of species, made such a great impact in the Victorian times. The theory of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin, it raised a lot of questions in the mind of people. The people had the traditional Bible-based faith of the origin of man. Now there is a new theory which brought about a lot of doubt and skepticism in the mind of people. We have talked about the Victorian Compromise. There is a compromise between science and religion. Many people believed that the scientific theory was correct and many abandoned their faith. So there was a tension between religion and science because of the theory brought about by Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution. Then we discussed about John Stuart Mill, J.S. Mill, and his theory of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an important topic. Greatest happiness for the greatest number of people was the maxim of the theory of utilitarianism by J.S. Mill. Jeremy Bentham was the proponent. Now J.S. Mill is carrying on the theory proposed by Jeremy Bentham. Happiness is defined as pleasure. Greatest happiness for greatest number of people. What is happiness? Happiness is pleasure. The theory of Mill also made a lot of impact in the Victorian society. It was the force behind the rise of democratic reforms in the Victorian era. So the theory of J.S. Mill also is affecting the social life of the people. Darwin affected society, Karl Marx affected society, similarly J.S. Mill. Another important character we discussed was Sigmund Freud and his theory of psychoanalysis. And we said about the conscious and the unconscious mind of the individual, the id, ego and the superego. We also discussed about the psychoanalytic theory of literary criticism, the psychoanalytic literary criticism. The concept about the individual, that the conscious mind was like the tip of an iceberg compared to the unconscious mind. So it also made a lot of impact, a lot of changes in the Victorian society. Now the traditionally held definition about individuals were changed. The most of what we know is only a very little. The unconscious is far more greater than the conscious mind. Now we talked about the Victorian Compromise. Now Victorian Compromise is an important topic that we should remember. The Victorian society was largely peaceful due to the sense of compromise that reigned during the period. While in other countries there was a lot of tension and blood revolution, the Victorian society, the Victorian English society was largely peaceful because of the Victorian Compromise. We said that it is a compromise between the rich and the poor. It's a compromise between science and religion. It's a compromise between romanticism and realism. And lastly, it is a compromise between royalism and democracy. So we have dealt in detail what Victorian Compromise is. In our subsequent lectures, we also talked about the British Empire, the great, the mighty British Empire, the British Empire on which the sun never sets, the empire on which the sun never sets. In that lecture, we talked about the East India Company, the first war of independence and how the struggle was put down by the British government, and how Queen Victoria became the Empress of India in 1867. So we talked about the great British Empire, the empire on which the sun never sets. Then we spent a few lectures on discussing the Victorian novels. Now, as we said, the Victorian novel was, during the Victorian period, novel was the most flourishing genre of the time. The most flourishing, the most popular genre of the Victorian time was the novel. We talked about the early Victorian novelists as well as the later Victorian novelists, and we discussed three important novelists and their important novels. Now, we talked about Charles Dickens and his social concerns. We talked about George Eliot and Thomas Hardy. Now the rest of the lectures we spent on discussing the Victorian poetry. Though novel was the prominent genre of the time, so the Victorian times, there was significant good poetry that was written during the Victorian times. We talked about the characteristics of the Victorian poetry, and we discussed some of the important poets of the time. The most prominent, the most representative of the Victorian times was Alfred Lord Tennyson. We talked about Robert Browning and his dramatic monologue, and we talked about Matthew Arnold and his literary criticisms. We also discussed about the pre-Raphaelites, the fleshy school of poetry, who shared the theme art for art's sake with the aestheticians. And in our last lecture, we talked about aestheticians with special reference to Oscar Wilde. So my dear students, with this we are coming to the end of the first unit. I want to present before you all the university questions that were asked from this particular unit. The first type, answer in a word or sentence. The first question, who proposed the theory of utilitarianism? The second question that was used in the university exam, who is the author of In Memoriam? The third question, which is the first novel of Charles Dickens? All these are university questions. The fourth one, name any two plays of Oscar Wilde. The fifth question, A Tale of Two Cities is written by whom? The sixth question, give the title of Charles Darwin's book on evolutionary theory. The seventh question that appeared in one of the question paper is, what is the real name of the writer George Eliot? The eighth question, who is the author of the poetry collection Dramatis Personae? Who wrote Dramatis Personae? The ninth question, which appeared in one of the question papers, is, to which school of poetry did D.G. Rossetti and Christina Rossetti belong? Which school they belong to? Tenth question, in which year was the Great Exhibition held? Now we have had a lecture on Great Exhibition. 11th question, to which movement did William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais belong? To which movement? The 12th question, who wrote the famous poem Fra Lippo. So these were one word or one sentence questions which were asked in the university. Second category, answer in a short paragraph not exceeding 50 words. The first question that comes under that category, which appeared in one of the question papers, is the Reform Act of 1832. The second question, development of medical science during the Victorian era. Third one, characteristics of the poems of Robert Browning. We are talking about Robert Browning, his dramatic monologue, etc. The fourth question, mention any three features of the fleshy school of poetry or the pre-Raphaelites. The fifth question, Victorian England was compromising. Do you agree? We have had a lecture on Victorian Compromise. The sixth question that appeared under this category is science and modernism in Victorian England. Science and modernism in Victorian England. The seventh question that appeared in one of the question papers is features of pre-Raphaelite poetry. Now the question is being repeated. Fleshy school of poetry, pre-Raphaelite poetry. Eighth question, Thomas Hardy and his regional novels. Talked about regional novels. The ninth question, the decadence or the aestheticians. The 10th question, the pre-Raphaelite school. This question is repeated in almost all the question papers. The pre-Raphaelite school. The 11th question under this category is Charles Dickens and social concern. The 12th question, explain art for art's sake. The 13th question, Hardy's Wessex novels. The 14th question under this category is, what is a dramatic monologue? The 15th question is the aesthetic school. The 16th question that appeared in one of the question papers, once again pre-Raphaelites. The 17th question, literature as moral history of modern life in the hands of Dickens and Thackeray. The next category, answer in one or two paragraphs of about 100 words. It's a long answer question. The first question, the rise of Oxford and Cambridge universities. The second question, Matthew Arnold and his major works, appeared in another question paper. The third question that appeared in one question paper is advancement of science and technology in Victorian England. The fourth question, it is once again repeated, Thomas Hardy and his as a regional novelist. Fourth question. The fifth question, Charles Dickens and the Victorian novel. Sixth question, dramatic monologue during the Victorian period. My dear students, all these questions are repeated many times. Please study them well. The seventh question, religious doubt in Victorian poetry. Religious doubt, we have talked about science and religion, the tension between them, skepticism, doubt, etc. The eighth question, the pre-Raphaelite school. This question is repeated in almost all the question papers, pre-Raphaelites. The ninth question, the plays of Oscar Wilde, the important four comedies of Oscar Wilde. The 10th question, religious doubt in Victorian poetry. Once again a repeated question. The 11th question, the novel as the dominant form of literature in the Victorian period. The most prominent genre was the novel during the Victorian period. The 12th question, Alfred Lord Tennyson's poetry, the characteristics of his poetry. 13th one, George Eliot and the domestic novel. And there is a last category, answer in about 300 words. These are essay questions. how did the literature reflect the Victorian age? Essay question. The second question, bring about the salient features of the reforms of Victorian England. Second question. Third one, how were the social and political developments of the Victorian age reflected in literature? Now this question is repeated again and again. The social and political developments of the Victorian age, how did they reflect in literature? The fourth one, how were the concerns of the Victorian age reflected in the literature? All these are same questions that is repeated again and again. So my dear students, as we come to the end of this first unit, as we are concluding this first unit, I have presented before you all the questions that were asked in different university questions for the past 4 or 5 years. So I will humbly request all of you, please answer all these questions. Do it by yourself, or you can get the help of your companions also. All the questions that are mentioned in our lecture today, please take them down and answer them. And if you answer them well, and if you study them well, I am sure you will do very well in your examinations. So my dear students, we have concluded our first unit. Thank you for your patient listening. Please have a joyful learning. Don't take literature as a burden. Please study them with a lot of joy. Thank you. Have a nice time. Stay safe.